Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is Wednesday, July 4th, 2018, so happy 4th of July. Let's see what happened today. Well, I didn't really pay much attention. The U.S. markets were closed, although I did see someone climb the Statue of Liberty. I think they were protesting something or other, ICE. Don't know if the person who climbed has gotten down yet, but I know there were police on the scene. And for whatever reason, they evacuated the island, so whoever was there had to leave so they can figure out how to get this person off of the Statue of Liberty. That's about the only news I saw today of any interest. The gold markets reopened, and they are flat. So gold is at 1256, and silver at 16.07. And the crypto markets were also pretty much flat. Not much movement there either. Litecoin at about 85.5, $85.50. Bitcoin at about 6,500, $87, and Ethereum about $466. So not much movement on the cryptos. But today I wanted to talk about the SDRs. And there's a lot of talk always, and it gets discussed in terms like somehow it's some type of in-the-know secret plan that people who know about SDRs, somehow they've got a leg up on you. The people who can talk about SDRs, they really know what's going on. And the latest is they've been, in the last few years, trying to tie in SDRs with gold. There's always some game changer going on there. What I want to do is go through, it came up last night in the live stream, this SDR thing, and I want to go through, I've researched SDRs. I want to explain what they are, what the purpose of them, and what can and cannot happen with them. Alright, so SDRs, we should have called this maybe demystifying SDRs. SDRs are special drawing rights. And they're not new. They've been around since 1969. And they were created by the International Monetary Fund. You might have heard of the International Monetary Fund. People call it the IMF. That's who created these special drawing rights. Now, why did they create them, and why 1969? Well, in 1969, the U.S. the world was on the gold standard pursuant to the Bretton Woods Agreements of 1944. And under those agreements, the United States was selected, or the dollar was selected as the world's reserve currency. And it wasn't on a gold standard, in the classical gold standard, where every country would measure its currency by a unit of gold. It was one where the United States dollar would be pegged to gold, so to speak, in that if a foreign central bank that was a signatory to the Bretton Woods Agreements wanted, they could bring their dollars that they had accumulated in trade, or however they had got them, and bring them to the U.S. Treasury and receive gold in exchange for them. So the idea was that the dollar was as good as gold, and that would give people confidence. And they had discussed, John Maynard Keynes was one of the figures at these meetings, and he did not want the gold backing. Remember, he's the one with the famous quote that gold is a barbarous relic. But the other countries, especially the European countries, they wanted gold as part of the monetary system. He wanted to do something called the Bancor, which is probably a precursor to the SDR. Now, when the SDR was created in 1969, the U.S. was still funneling gold out to its trading partners who were bringing their dollars to the United States Treasury and asking for gold. The problem that the Bretton Woods Agreement had was flawed to begin with, but as it went along, and the United States was no longer the dominant exporter, and it started to run some deficits, that meant that other countries started accumulating dollars in payment, and they would start to bring them to the United States, and there was an issue where Switzerland, Germany, France were making increasing requests for redemption for their dollars. Now, in the late 60s, they were trying to keep the price of gold at $35. The gold price had been set prior to the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944 at $35 an ounce in 1934 by the Gold Act of 1934 by the U.S. Congress. So the gold price was set at $35 in 1934, and by 1968-69, it was still $35. Now, why didn't they change the price of gold? Well, they didn't. The U.S. did not want the dollar to be devalued, which it would have if they were to allow gold to go higher or to peg it higher. So there were two issues with the situation in the late 60s. The price of gold clearly had to be, through the London Gold Pool, brought down. Also, probably even more important, was there wasn't enough liquidity in the system for expanding trade. Remember, the price of gold was still $35 an ounce. It hadn't risen in value, so you couldn't have the elasticity of having more value traded because the gold price was at $35, and gold production wasn't keeping up. There wasn't enough gold being produced, and in the final years of the Bretton Woods Agreement, South Africa produced, I think, something ridiculous, 1,200 tons. I mean, the amount of gold that they had to produce, it was the money supply in a sense, and they just couldn't keep up. Now, the simple solution you would think would be just let the gold price go higher and you'd have your issue, but that would then devalue the dollar, and the United States wasn't up for that. So what did the United States do in 1971, which was obvious by 1968-69, was that they were not going to be able to keep dishing out the gold for people who bring in their dollars, and not people, I mean the central banks. By 1969, they had recognized that there was a need, the IMF had recognized that there was a need for central bank liquidity for this expanding trade, and there weren't enough dollars or gold to meet it. Now, before we go further and talk about these special drawing rights, let's talk about what the IMF is. The IMF was part of the creation of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The IMF is and has been run by the United States. No matter what anyone tells you about China, they're going to move the headquarters to China. That's in the charter that the country with the largest country by GDP will have the headquarters, but so far that hasn't happened. But the main thing that people need to understand about the SDR and the IMF is the United States runs the IMF. Full stop. Under the charter in the IMF, it takes 85% of the voting countries to make any changes to the charter. The United States currently has 16.52% of the vote. So those of you good at math, you realize that no one will ever get to 85%, even if they all vote against the United States. The best they can muster would be something about 84%. Which means, even if the world turned on the United States, the U.S. would still run the IMF. The second highest voting member is Japan. They have about 6.79% of the vote. Well, given that, just the U.S. and Japan could easily block any type of move. Let's just keep that in mind, that the IMF is run by, was set up by basically the United States. Now, back to what are SDRs. SDRs are reserve assets that are based on the value of a basket of 5 currency: the dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, the euro, and more recently, the Chinese renminbi, RMB, or yuan. The dollar and the euro represent the largest amounts, and then the SDR, the pound and the yen and the yuan make up the rest of it. The SDR, however, is not backed by the 5 currencies. They're valued in relation to the 5 currencies. So that means if you have $100 billion worth of SDRs, there isn't an equal amount of, let's say, $40 billion, 30 billion euros. There is not an amount backing them. This is a real stretch. This is the IMF creating something that is basically a fiction. They issue SDRs, and they're based on the value, not on the backing of these currencies. Interestingly enough, even if they were backed by the currencies, which would defeat the purpose, they are not. They're a fiction. There's no backing of the SDR whatsoever. They're just made in relation to the other fiat currencies, which could be printed at will. And SDRs are, there's only, I think, 300 billion of them, and only the IMF can issue them. And they're allocated to the IMF member countries. They're supposed to be allocated to member countries in proportion to the size of their global of their size in relation to the global economy. And central banks only hold the SDRs as reserve assets. Only IMF can issue them, and they issue them to the central banks. You can't use SDRs to buy goods and services. You can't take an SDR and go and buy something with it. They only can be exchanged among central banks. There's no SDR coin or note. However, a bond can be denominated in SDRs, but payable in a sovereign currency. You may have heard there was an SDR bond, but it wasn't redeemable in SDRs. It was just based on an interest rate that you would pay based on the SDR. So, for example, not as a joke, but I put that Smaulgld accepts SDR denominated contributions. And you could figure out how much you want to donate to Smaulgld by using the SDR conversion rate. And the SDR conversion rate is calculated by the 5 currencies that belong to it. And then you just figure out what the rate is. And then you could figure out how many dollars or euros you want to send based on your SDR benchmark. That's all the SDR is a benchmark. But in the case of the IMF, they can actually issue these things called special drawing rights that they alone can create and say, here's 100 billion SDR, and the price of it is, not that they did anything to create it, they created it out of thin air, the price of it is the relative values added up of the 5 currencies that are in it. And so that way they thought they could add liquidity to the market, because if the reason, this is the point I was getting at earlier, they have them as not backed was, if all you wanted to do was add liquidity, they do what they do today. Just print more of your own currency. There's no need to create an SDR. But the idea was the United States didn't want to devalue its currency. So the little genius in this SDR trick was, well, we won't have to print any more yen or pounds or, at the time there weren't euro, dollars in order to pull this off. We'll just issue more SDRs. And we can issue these SDRs without having to worry about issuing more of the domestic currencies. So you can see it's a way of, it's inflationary without the individual countries having to print up their own additional currency. And because the SDR itself isn't backed, then they don't have to collect them and they can just print them as many as they can. So that's why there are commentators that say that an ideal solution to a debt crisis is, rather than print up more of the currency to cover the increasing debt, is you go to what's called the clean balance sheet, and the IMF just issues more SDRs, and that will cover, and that'll be your reset. And then the idea is they're going to add gold to it because people won't trust the SDR. Well, why would they trust it anyway? Because the SDR still doesn't eliminate the idea that there's a dollar, a yen, a RMB, a pound, and a euro. So those currencies still have to exist in order to benchmark the SDR. So now that you kind of know what an SDR is, let's look at some of these, what I think are, they don't make much sense. I'll tell you why. Okay, so back in I think it was last summer, there was a Zero Hedge article saying, "Dear President Trump, America's in for a rude awakening. Here are some facts that prove that the SDR will become the global currency. The IMF issues this currency. They're called SDRs. Fact, the IMF has confirmed that they want to replace the dollar with SDRs. Fact," and then they bring in the whole blockchain stuff that they can put the SDRs on a blockchain, and now you've got currency substitution, and now you've got a task force set up and they can implement this SDR, and then it's game over for the dollar. And of course, they're going to put gold in it, so they're going to have to revalue gold. See, now you're getting into fantasy land. Because if you remember what I said at the top, the U.S. runs the IMF. The IMF can't just decide they want to issue a globalist currency called SDRs and replace the dollar. Why? Because the United States has 16.52% of the votes, and you need 85% to do anything like this. But China is behind it. They've given the sign. Who cares what China wants? China has 6.8% of the vote. China can want it all they want. They don't run the IMF. Even if they had allies, if they had every other country agreeing with them, that somehow they thought it was a good idea to replace the dollar and crush the dollar and replace it with SDRs, they still wouldn't get the U.S. vote unless the United States thought it was in their interest somehow to do this. But that's not how these warnings are. This is warning to the United States that the IMF is going to do this to the United States dollar. They can't do anything to the dollar without the United States agreeing to have it done to it, which I would doubt unless you had some type of change in America, which is always possible. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the IMF doing this to us. I mean, it's possible that you get in some left-wing country that just thinks the United States shouldn't be in charge of the IMF anymore and make sure that the United States gives up its veto power. But that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the IMF imposing this on the United States, and that cannot happen if you look at the charter documents of the IMF. The United States has, not only do they have a veto right over changes to what happens at the IMF, they even have a veto right over reallocating how the votes go. So if the United States doesn't want any other country or combination of countries to get more than 85%, they won't approve it. So they're stuck at 16.52% or something like that. So nothing is going to happen to the United States by the IMF or because China wants it or the BRICS have had it, whatever the fantasy story is. And by the way, there is nothing in the IMF that says anything about gold being part of the SDR. That's just, that's theorizing. If you're going to have a SDR, to the point that I made, that these things are unbacked totally. They're just an invention of the IMF. So why would anyone trust them? Well, why would anyone trust them if you sprinkle a little gold in there too? You might as well just use gold as the standard. So the SDR thing never made that much sense to me. But then again, a lot of these stories don't make sense. And there's a reason why we don't have gold 50,000, silver 15-to-1 ratio, COMEX default. All these stories, they're based on facts, but they leave out or purposely or just they don't know that there's certain things, certain impediments to these events happening, and therefore, if the event doesn't happen, then the price of the gold or silver doesn't move. And then we've got to tell you another story because there's another reason why gold or silver may rise. All right, let's take a look at some of the comments we got. I hope that was cleared things some up. Tom Manley, happy Independence Day to all. To you as well. Sniper will drop them quickly. I think you're talking about the person climbing the statue. I don't think they were looking to shoot them down. I think they were trying to talk them down, almost as if they were, and I didn't really follow, as if they were like a suicide risk. In a way, you might. I don't know. I haven't been to the statue. I have been, but I haven't looked at it as like if you were to climb it, what type of danger you might be in. Hello, Silver Wolverine. Gusta Broken shows up. Good to see you again. All right. Tom Manley, U.S. stack the deck again. All right. Hello, Tom, says DW. Hey, DW, have a great Independence Day. I don't want to get involved in these private conversations. All right. Gus, I won't let you down, Smaulgld. That's good. I didn't expect to see you tonight. Good to see you. All right. Let's see here. Tom Manley, SDRs are central bank exclusive. That's right. Got it. Only they can issue them, and only they can transfer amongst themselves. and they're not backed by anything. They're just based on the values of the individual currencies. So 0% money. Yeah, it's a way of the IMF creating their own inflation outside the system, because otherwise each country would have to create it. Central bankers have the good luck. Think about it. You're right. They just print up an SDR. The SDR is still a basket of other fiat currencies, so if all are junk or worthless, why should they accept why should they accept the SDR as a new currency? They're all right, because I think you raised this point, or someone raised it the other night. The dollar index, everyone says, well, the dollar's losing value, but the dollar index went higher because it means the dollar didn't lose as much value as the other currencies of which it's being measured against. So you can have almost all the currencies being worth next to nothing, but if one is worth more than the other, then that one goes higher. And then if you had a basket based on that, the SDR would just be worthless. You're just one step removed from the worthlessness. Gusta broken. Oh wait, didn't the countries demand each country put in so much gold when they joined the SDR program? No. See, that's another thing. That was the whole thing about when China, they made this big hype, and they said, well, China's going to disclose so much gold in 2015. They hadn't reported since 2009, and at the time they had 1,054 tons. And there was a lot of hype. Oh, if they want to get into the SDR, they're going to have to show they've got 10,000 tons of gold. I don't know where that came from, because England at the time had 310 tons, and they were in the SDR. The idea for being in the SDR has nothing to do with how much gold you have. I mean, Kazakhstan should be in the SDR then. They have more gold than England. It has to do with the size of your economy. It never had anything to do with gold. But because people don't know what the SDR is, and they hear somebody talking fast about the SDR, they figure, oh, China is trying to get into the SDR. They're boosting their gold reserves. No, they weren't. When Switzerland joined the IMF, they had to sell their gold. There's no gold requirement to get into the IMF. All right, so China added gold, and they stopped adding it. There might have been something to it. I don't know, but they stopped adding gold when they got admitted, not when they got admitted to the SDR, but the year later when they actually officially joined it. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but I don't think they were required to have a certain amount of gold to be in the SDR. Gusta broken, covert action. Come on, SG, give me a wrench. Don't know what that means. Tom Manley, if that basket contains a Venezuelan dollars, I'll pass. No. Remember, the Venezuelan dollars are backed by El Petro. Supposedly their very famous cryptocurrency. That was another game changer that was going to challenge dollar hegemony, because Venezuela was going to trade outside the dollar. They were going to use their cryptocurrency, and they were going to accept yuan as payment for their oil, and that meant de-dollarization and game over for the dollar as we enter into a multipolar world. Well, the stories around the SDR are very similar. They're very much loaded with somehow the IMF is going to crush the dollar because the other countries have had it, and of course the twist there is then gold is the savior because they can add it to the SDR and allay everyone's fears about that being unbacked. But the issue with all that is the world doesn't want gold. The only people who want gold, I had this discussion with Keith Werner early today. I did an interview with him. He's talking about his project with Nevada, which is the issuance of a gold note, is that the clamoring for a gold standard of the type where gold gets revalued and gets put into the system is only wanted by those that hold gold and are looking for that one-time pop. The populace that could care less what happens to gold. They don't want gold. They don't know anything about gold. They want gold. They want it in jewelry and trinkets. So the idea that they're going to add gold to the SDR gets gold holders excited. But it's not realistic because the rest of the world doesn't want that to be there. The rest of the central banks, all of them, they're interested in the fiat concept. They love the idea. The reason they like the idea of the SDR is they don't have to keep inflating their currencies. You let the IMF do it for you. And then they just issue more SDRs to everybody, and everybody carries on without having to add more debt. I mean, in that sense, it's a brilliant banker scheme. It's got nothing to do with gold. And as most people are commenting on the board here, why would you want If you don't want the currencies individually, why would you want to value anything on them as a basket, especially if you don't even get the currencies that are on back? So, thanks for clearing up the gold, SDR, DW. SDR is a game changer. Absolutely not. In fact, you can see it's been around since 1969, and it's just a basket of it's an unbacked basket of currencies. That's all it is. There's no special significance to it whatsoever. Do you think we're in for a currency reset to DW? I don't know. I mean, you might have thought we could have had a currency reset in 2008. The only thing they were thinking about at the time was how do they flood the markets with liquidity, and that was the Fed. Now, there is an issue. The reason this theory has some legs about the SDR is who's going to bail out the countries as they continue to bail themselves out with additional debt. And the idea is that the IMF can just print up these SDRs. But that's just another, and then, you can have another agency. You can call it the Super IMF, who then makes SDR 2.0. And when they get to, so it doesn't, remember, all this debt has to be backed by something, and it's not, or it has to be paid back. And so I'm not even sure the SDR is a viable reset solution. There needs to be some, I think it's conversion of debt into things. I think you need to have forgiveness of debt, jubilee, something. But just printing up SDRs and then sprinkling a little gold dust on top of them, I don't know how that gives anyone any confidence. And, they haven't really been issuing more and more and more SDRs. They've been around since 1969. There's no magic in them, and to me, they sound faker than the people criticizing Bitcoin, because they're just invented and you put them on the blockchain. That doesn't give them any special value. All right, Augusta Broker, DW just goes, okay, good reason to be your own central banker. Well, the best thing, Tom, would be your own central banker if you also had the power to, when you realize you were in debt too much, you just create a new currency that you can just buttress up your finances with. So, all right, everyone. Well, that's it. Happy 4th of July to everyone. If you missed the beginning, go back. I went through what SDRs are, the special drawing rights created by the IMF in 1969. And the main takeaway here is the IMF can't do anything to the United States. The United States is the 16.52% voting power, voting bloc, and you need 85% in order to have any resolution or change in the IMF charter. So if the IMF wanted to, and was on record, and China was all for it, wanted to issue SDRs and dethrone the dollar as a reserve currency, it's all fantasy. They can't do it unless the United States goes along with it. Thanks very much for listening.